After leaving university, Mesmer set up a medical practice and quickly began to give demonstrations and lectures to large audiences of interested students and visitors. Many of his colleagues were unhappy with his behaviour. The University Medical Committee banned the demonstrating and use of mesmerism from its hospital wards and lecture theatre.
You're amused?
Oh, merely skeptical. How would you go about it?
I've used hypnotism more than once in healing. Not for profit. I'm not a professional. But I do think I could help you. If you'd care to...
I can't think of a pleasanter experience.
Now you will do exactly as I tell you.
In this episode, we'll explore the world of mesmerism, from its development within the scientific era through to approaches being used by healers around the time mesmerism first appeared, to the creation, spread and downfall of mesmerism. Since the dawn of the scientific era in the mid-1500s, which was built upon aspects of Greek, Roman and Islamic science, among others, people began to focus on trying to understand the world around them in a measurable and evidenced way. If something couldn't be understood, they didn't want to just attribute it to a higher power of some kind. They wanted to explore it and figure it out. As well as this move to understand the physical world in a new way, there was a move to understand humans and life, with the development of modern neurology beginning in the 1500s and psychiatry following in the 1600s. One of the earliest psychiatric books was The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton in 1621. And the 1700s, William Batty wrote his Treatise on Madness in 1758, helping to advance the view that those experiencing mental illness should be treated with compassion and helped. This was likely progressed further along in the late 1700s, when the King of England, George III, was experiencing mental illness, likely due to poisoning from products that he was ingesting containing arsenic, which was detected in high levels in samples of his hair examined in 2005. He had experienced mental illness in the 1760s and again in the 1780s. A high-profile person like the King of England experiencing mental illness and going away for a time to recover and seeming to have gotten better may have encouraged people to see mental illness as something that can be cured or at least treated to some extent. In the early 1770s, a Jesuit priest, Father Gassner, was curing people through exorcisms. Gassner is often touted as the likely root of modern hypnosis, rather than the more famous Franz Anton Mesmer. "Kneel before me," Gassner told a nun. He asked her name and for a brief description of the presenting illness. "Do you agree to do anything I order?" he continued. The nun responded affirmatively. In Latin, Gassner continued, "If there be anything preternatural about the disease, I order in the name of Jesus that it manifest itself immediately." At this point, the nun began to have convulsions, which Gassner took to be proof that this illness was caused by an evil spirit rather than a natural illness. Gassner continued in Latin to order that the spirit creates convulsions in various named parts of the body. Once this was followed, he ordered that the patient manifests stillness, grief, anger, and various other emotions and states. Once he had demonstrated his power over the evil spirit, with all of his suggestions being followed, demonstrating that he had tamed the spirit, he commanded that the spirit leave the patient's body, and the patient was healed of their ailment. Gassner had started his cures a few years earlier than Mesmer, and they had more in common with what would become hypnosis. But Gassner claimed supernatural reasons for his cures. He was casting out evil spirits, whereas when Mesmer appeared on the scene, he was trying to explain what he was doing from a scientific perspective. Although Mesmer clung on to the idea that what he was doing involved something physical and wouldn't entertain the idea that it could be psychological. In 1775, Mesmer was asked to demonstrate his abilities before the Academy of Sciences in Munich. He successfully did this and was subsequently asked for his opinion on what Gassner was doing. Mesmer said that Gassner may well have greater powers of magnetism than he himself possessed, and was, without his own knowledge, using these powers to cure his patients. Following what Mesmer said, the Church, who had been looking for a reason for banning Gassner due to his unorthodox ways of working, had Gassner banned from practicing. He died in obscurity 4 years later, and has remained relatively unknown in the story of hypnosis ever since. Franz Anton Mesmer was the first to have a go at developing a scientific mind-body healing approach. Mesmer was born in 1734. Aged 26, Mesmer began studying medicine at the University of Vienna. Mesmer's dissertation was on the influence of the planets. It was an attempt to bring the gravitational effects of the movement of the planets on the human body into medicine. The thinking was that if gravity can create the tides, then perhaps it can have an influence on the human body and may be linked to illness through a universal fluid. His dissertation was largely plagiarized from the works of English physician Richard Mead, who proposed a similar theory back in 1704. After leaving university, Mesmer set up a medical practice. In 1773, a young woman living with Mesmer was experiencing a cyclical illness. Mesmer realized that he was able to predict when her next attack of the illness would strike. To this point, he had been unable to cure her, only offer her temporary relief through the means of normal medicine. He felt that the cyclical nature of the illness was the perfect example of his theory proposed in his dissertation. The treatment, he felt, would be found in the discovery of some kind of substance which would enable him to control the ebb and flow of the universal fluid being influenced by the gravitational effects. Mesmer thought that magnets might be the answer, as magnets can attract and repel, similar to the way gravity seems to influence things. In July 1774, when the patient's next attack of her illness struck, he decided to try to treat her with magnets. When my patient had another attack, Mesmer wrote, I fixed 2 horseshoe magnets to her feet and another in the shape of a heart on her breast. Immediately, she felt a burning, tearing pain which spread up her legs as far as her hips, where it was joined by a similar pain which descended from the magnets on her breast down one side and up the other to the crown of her head. As these pains dissipated, they left all her joints burning like fire. The pain continued throughout the night. The symptoms gradually disappeared. She became insensitive to the action of the magnets, and the seizures were over. Mesmer repeated this treatment over the coming days and weeks and found that he was able to direct the symptoms with the magnets as if the magnets were having an effect on the universal fluid within the patient's body, and that over time the symptoms reduced. Mesmer kept the supplier of the magnets, Maximilian Hell, who was also working on magnetic cures, informed of his progress. Hell beat Mesmer to the publication of an article about the use of magnets for treating illness. If that had become the dominant knowledge, then maybe we would be talking about Hellism rather than Mesmerism. Hell claimed that he had suggested the idea of using magnets to Mesmer. Hell felt that the shape of the magnets was important, whereas Mesmer felt that it wasn't. Mesmer thought of the magnets as just being a conductor of the universal fluid within the body, what he termed animal magnetism. Within a year, Mesmer had concluded that different objects could be magnetized. He had so many people coming to see him for treatment that he would magnetize tubs of iron filings, or pass his animal magnetism into trees. He would carry out cures, like having someone touching a magnetized tree, and that person would hold hands with the person next to them, and that person to another person, and so on, with a chain of connected people holding hands to the person touching the tree. He would then touch one of the people with a glass pole to spread his animal magnetism into the people. Patients would convulse and seizure, and many would leave apparently cured. Mesmer quickly progressed from here to believing no objects were required, that it was possible to transfer personal animal magnetism into people, even from a distance. He would sometimes just look at a patient and raise a hand in a meaningful looking way, and that would be enough for the person to convulse and be cured. When working one-to-one with patients, Mesmer would sit very close opposite the person, with his knees on the outside of the patient's knees. He would stroke the patient's body, often their shoulders, down their arms, to their hands, holding their thumbs for a moment before repeating this. Sometimes he would stroke all the way down to the feet, sometimes touching exposed skin or holding parts of the person's body. Other times, the passes would be close to the patient's body, but not actually touching. Sometimes he would touch the patient's stomach and lower back as a way of channeling the magnetic fluid into the patient's whole body. These treatments were often dramatic. There appeared to be a lot of showmanship and flair. Mesmer was moving in the direction of working more psychologically, using communication that was more about focusing and absorbing attention and increasing responsiveness, involving expectation and the imagination. But he never publicly admitted this. He continued to push the explanation that it was to do with a real physical substance. He progressed from using magnets to magnetizing objects, turning them into instruments of healing, then moving on to believing he contained enough magnetic fluid that he could heal people with his touch, then with passes of his hands over people, then by speaking with authority. Despite this shift from magnets to any object, to not needing an object and instead using physical touch, and then hand passes and on to speaking authoritatively, he seemed to cling to his theories rather than change his views, despite being presented with evidence that was pointing towards magnetism and objects being unnecessary, that the same results could be achieved through communication between the therapist and the patient. In part 2, we'll explore how this refusal to progress his theories was to be his undoing, and how mesmerism developed in the wake of this.
Hey, you made it to the end. I really appreciate it. Now do me a favor, hang around for the credits.